Obaba, welcome. Again, knowing Charles, I won't do that, and I think Obaba is just left preserved for one person. Yeah, I come from a context where we used to have somebody called Mzee, and if you dare call somebody else Mzee, you would be jailed. He was the only Mzee. And when his successor took over, he tried to use the word Mzee, and it never gained traction. I'm talking about the founding president of Kenya, who was known as Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. So I want to start first and foremost by thanking Prof. Peter Vale, who since last year reminded me that, do you know that Professor Charles Van Onselen will be turning 80, and we need to do something about it. And then I said, yes, I think that's a brilliant idea. I don't come from a tradition and a culture where they celebrate birthdays. It's only my children that keep reminding me that I'm getting old. And as a matter of fact, over the last week or two, they decided that they were going to celebrate my birthday last week, and then my son also celebrated his birthday this week. The only thing that I love about birthdays is that you get to know what people think or pretend that they know about you, and sometimes it's extremely exciting. So thanks, Peter, for getting this going, but also just, writing the conceptual note for our seminar today. I also want to thank, because I won't get a chance, the CAST team, led by Casti, Ayanda, and Rose. They spend a lot of time working around these events. And then I want to thank the panelists, our eminent historians that are sitting over here. I will introduce them briefly, when we start, when I'm inviting them over to talk to us. It was a very short notice that we gave them to speak on Professor Van Onselen's works. And as you know, there are many. There are many books. So it was a huge task to expect them to have read all those books. Charles, this is really an exciting moment. Knowing you, I know you don't like rituals. And I also know that you don't like, these forms of celebrations. That's why we disguised it in the form of a seminar. So we decided that we were going to have a seminar, and we cajoled you together with Peter, and I'm excited that we succeeded in getting you to accept that you will be sharing this moment with us. It's always very difficult to talk about Charles. I got to know Charles, not very well when I was still at the University of the Witwatersrand in the 90s. I would later on work very closely with the late wife, God bless her soul, Belinda Bosoli, when I was assistant dean research and became part of the university research executive committee. Later on, I would move over to this place. But before that, as a budding scholar, I'd written a proposal. I'd written a proposal to do a biographical narrative of one of the Kenyan nationalists. And I sent my proposal to the council to get some funding. They were very excited about the proposal, but they thought it was premature. So they sent one of the colleagues that was working with Charles, if I may, Professor Tim Cousins. Tim Cousins had audited some of his lectures on slavery and memory, an incredible scholar too, a biographer, of note too. So Tim Cousins came to talk to me and said, James, we really liked your proposal, but it's too early for you to write a proposal on a biography. You cannot write a biography at this age. A biography is something that you write when you have divorced, once or twice. I said, So I have to wait until I divorce before I can start writing a biography? And then he laughed it off. And you can understand why that biography was never written. I nevertheless got money to go to Michigan for my sabbatical and started reflecting on what I was doing. I wrote a few papers on that biography. But Tim Cousins also told me, have you read The Seed is Mine? I said, what is that? Sounds like a biblical phrase. And so he told me, go and look for The Seed is Mine by Prof. Van Onselen. And I went for it, and I saw, this one I was given by Prof. The one I bought has a different color. And I looked at it and said, oh, biographies are this huge, Can I really accomplish and write a biography of this size? But one thing that really struck me about Charles' work was the quotation that was used on this biography. The biography is about, those of you who know the book, Cass Main was a sharecropper. And Cass Main is quoted by Charles to be saying, the seed is mine, the plowshares are mine, the span of oxen are mine, everything is mine, only the land is theirs. That's profound. And as I reflected on it, I could see in this phrase, one, the personal dimension of biography, but I could also see in this single phrase, property relations in South Africa was fleshed out before me. A situation in which you could own all these things but land. In my own country, Kenya, which is also a former settler economy, we used to call these sharecroppers tenant at will. So that really struck me, the personal dimension, that in spite of the fact that this man did not own land, there was that will to be, that will to do something for himself. That for me was probably more important than the property relations that I read out of it, much as that too is important and continues to dog the history of this country. And I raise this precisely because I've always admired the work of Charles, precisely because I still believe he's still one of the finest social historians that I've ever come across on this continent. I was reading an article on Africa's historiography by an American historian, Frederick Cooper, and I noticed he singled out Charles is one of the very first scholars on this continent to push the narrative on social history. Those days when I was growing as a young scholar, we used to call it history from below. And there were very few people that would do that. And I think that over the years, Charles has done that superbly, drawing our attention to the micro-narratives, and if you like, the rotten underbelly of our society sometimes, and with gripping humor. I think that, for me, that's what makes this occasion special, and that's why, as a center, we decided that we needed to celebrate the intellectual history of this man. I think he deserves it, precisely because what he has allowed us to see. Study all the titles of Prof. Van Onselen's books, and you'll see that they speak so much. I trade in words, I'm a literary scholar, so the first thing that I go for are words. And Wole Soyinka, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, warns us that words are sacred. Do not use them carelessly. Choose your words carefully. Obviously, Soyinka is not a purist, a language purist, but he realizes that when you choose words, they must make sense. And I've always admired the way that Charles chooses the titles of his books. They speak volumes. Now with that, I want to welcome Prof. Peter Vale to introduce the idea that we are talking about today before we turn over to these wonderful people that are sitting in front of you.
Good afternoon. I didn't realize until the director pointed it out to us all that he too was a follower of Russian proverbs. Because there's a very famous Russian proverb which says, initiative shall be punished. So because of my initiative, I'm now being punished. And thank you for that, because that's the first mention of Russians that I'm going to make in this presentation. Often, first impressions matter most. So it is with Charles van Onselen. So you'll have to forgive me for taking you back 60 years and talking about mainly white men. Charles and I took a course at Wits in economic history. Far and away, it was the best course on offer in the arts faculty at the university. Far and away, it was absolutely riveting stuff. The great debate between the liberals and the Marxists was still to come. Charles was a senior student. He'd been a teacher, a traveler, and had graduated from Rhodes University, which I'm also going to talk about a little bit, in psychology and geography. Indeed, he had a BSc, which was rather strange. He also had a UED, which is a teacher's diploma. I, for my part then, was a near dropout. I'd majored in booze and rugby and all the hopeful pleasures which the 1960s would bring those of like me. The classes in economic history were held in huts, which stand now where Senate stands at Wits, brooding over the whole university. This was a neglected corner of the university where we gathered in these huts. The course was run by a man called, by a Peter Sellers lookalike. I'm sorry, I have to go back to the images of that time, but this was a Peter Sellers lookalike called Vivian Solomon. He was a distinguished scholar and a practicing economist and an interesting historian. So as Solomon hurried into the first class, room for the first lecture, a thin man with a mop of black hair stood up and moved to the blackboard. And with the determination and confidence of a man who'd passed his blackboard writing in his UED diploma, teaching diploma, wrote on the board, "Boycott register." I hoped we'd become friends. This was Charles van Onselen. And we have become friends. This said, it's a friendship that comes with a lot of potholes, and a friendship that comes with a deep empathy, a conversation about politics, ideas, and rugby. Not a little of the pitholes come from jesting. So here comes the Russian story. With many others, Charles and I attended a now famous conference of historians, and I feel as if I'm nervously intruding on your world here, in Moscow, early on in South Africa's transition. At an astonishingly exhausting and boring ceremonial at the Soviet African Studies Center in Moscow, went on for hours and hours and hours. I was sitting immediately in the row, immediately in front of Charles, and was seated in the same, he was immediately behind me, in front of Charles, who was sitting next to another rascal called Stan Torpedo. Suddenly, I felt the chair shaking, and the two of them in stage whispers started goading me. "Come on, Vale, start clapping. We've had enough of this. Come on, Vale, start clapping." And I wished that the world would have swallowed me. But this was the incendiary Charles, the heckler Charles, who developed strong reputations in this particular kind of student politics, both at Rhodes University and at Wits. The mundane details of Charles van Onselen's CV are well known to a group like this, and I only want to touch on bits of it. He was schooled in the Free State. And I can't tell you that without telling you about the class relationship which runs through history, even white history in this country. Because Colin Bundy once called the Free State, where Charles grew up, in his review of the Seedy's Mind, called it an unfashionable part of South Africa. And it struck me that there were two worlds there, the world in which Bundy was, and I wish he was here to react to it, and the world of Charles van Onselen. His undergraduate life was at Rhodes, and in an interesting cohort, he's in an interesting cohort, which are manifesting themselves more and more on the web. They call themselves Rhodians knocking on heaven's door. And they're the group between 1960 and 1975 and are preparing to go to Rhodes and have a party at Rhodes for the 120th celebration of that university's life. I think Rhodes at that time is very interesting. I'd spent a little time at the university, as people may know, because I think it was nothing more than, and this doesn't come up in Malam's book, it was an English village in Africa. And if you want to understand the crises both of the village and the university, that's where you've got to look. That's the moment of departure. The teaching diploma, for which some reason I have a picture of the group that Charles was in, includes a number of familiar faces. And one of the most interesting faces is the professor of education at Rhodes at the time, was a famous man called Koos Gerber. The backstory, which has emerged in many different places, and which I hope Charles will work on, because I think it is interesting, was a man called Koos Gerber, as I've already said, who was an alumnus of Koffiefontein, like John Foster. And he was a gatekeeper of note. And I think Charles's work is interesting in highlighting gatekeeping. And historians, when they approach these perspectives, may have a lot to say about gatekeeping. There's much to say about this period, but it will take and Rhodes at the time, take a historian of some caliber as Charles van Onselen to understand it, which is why we may never see it. We also have few historians which are interested in the dog-eat-dog world of institutions in South Africa. But those who are interested in epistemology will be interested in Charles's period at Wits, which brought his work from science much closer to social science. He took a degree in politics. I've never understood whether it was an honors degree until yesterday or whether it was a master's degree. And here, interestingly, politics at Wits at the time was one of the weakest departments in the country because the famous LeMay had left and they were rebuilding. I want to pause here just to make a theoretical point. I think more work needs to be done on epistemic communities. It seemed possible to argue that Wits, at the time, particularly amongst the students, was creating a very strong epistemic pod. And Charles was part of that epistemic pod. They went on to have a major influence in the social sciences in this country. And here is a list of names associated with that group: Dan O'Mara, Raf de Cat, Benji Pogrund, Gail Regaly, Belinda Bizzoli, and others. And I think work needs to be done on that pod because they bring us much closer to understanding the differences between historical interpretations. Of the years at Oxford, St. Antony's, seems to me we know very little, except that as we now through the self-proclamation made at the beginning of every Oxford graduation, that the only words they say in English, this is the best university in the world. And if there was ever a case of speaking from ex-cathedra pronouncements, that's the ex-cathedra pronouncement of Oxford University, where, of course, he did a D Phil. I'm happy to say Charles tells many self-deprecating jokes about Oxford. And perhaps today he'll tell us these. Then came the books, starting with Chibaru, based on the thesis. But what established Charles as a great storyteller, in my view, was the Wits inaugural lecture, which introduced us all to an astonishing story of a man called Nongoloza Matabule. The book is called The Small Matter of a Horse. And everybody in this country, once you've read The Seedy's Mind, should read The Small Matter of a Horse. I think Charles, Louise, and I must have given away 50 copies of this book, saying to people, if you want to understand bits of South Africa, this is the book to read. Each of us, of course, will have a favorite. But it's one thing to favor one, it's impossible to say which is the best. Although I note at Rhodes University, when it gave Charles his on doc in the 1980s, claimed that the best book ever written in South Africa was The Seedy's Mind. It's an astonishing claim to make, but I think the book stands in that group. In addition to this work, there were scholarly articles in weighty journals and public outlets like the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books. And just the other day, I picked up a book which I would have sent to our panelists, but it was too late, in September 1997 by Charles, of J.M. Coetzee's book, Childhood. The book is Boyhood. The book is called A Childhood on the Edge of History, and that too is really worth reading. I think I've said enough about Charles and in introducing him to you, but I couldn't resist this one joke. So here's the joke, and it's a joke which is about Charles, of Charles, made by Charles, but it belongs to a particular historical moment when the ambitious political scientist Dennis Worrell was running for a place in history and a place in South African politics. Charles got up at a public meeting and called him Dr. Squirrel. Not Worrell, Squirrel. The heckler continued his work. Oh, sorry about this. As to the topic, I've thought a little bit about this, but I think the director has opened up towards what we were looking, and we've also discussed it. But I want to put a South African story to it seems to me, what we are needing to talk about in biography and autobiography and history. UCT's John Higgins did a great interview with Jakes Gerwel, who was at one stage, the second most important person in the country, who was born in the Karoo, the child of a sharecropper. The family lived in Komadacha, in the Karoo in the Eastern Cape. Higgins asked Gerwel this question: tell us about the family circumstances, about the home. This is Gerwel's answer. We were dirt poor, but there were always books in the house. And I think that story embeds, I think, the struggles that we have had, individuals have had, in picking themselves up from unfashionable parts of the country and moving forward. So there's an inspirational story here that I think needs to be told and retold. If you wanted me to say what we were looking for, which is a different issue, I would say we want to understand a life and a body of work which injected politics and every story into history. Tell us how it is to put the storybook back in history. Or this one, tell us why your interest has been the capacious lives of limited problems. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, can I just have one? I promised Charles I'd do this, but he doesn't know that I'm going to do it. Yesterday I received a message from Canada, and it was a photograph sent to me by, I'm not going to tell you too because it's going to become obvious in a minute. Unfortunately, Kirsty told me you can't, in this hall, put up a photograph. This is the photograph of Professor Charles van Onselen and Professor Dan O'Mara, taken at the 1961 graduation of the two of them. You look sweet, Charles. So, thank you.
That's great, Peter. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I don't think there's anyone who could have done it better than you. Talking about the English village down in Makanda. A few years back, I was part of the National English Museum Board, and I visited Makanda for the first time. And my question was, where is the university? And I never understood why would the English love this place so much. He got so attached to it. That you're talking about the English village. And you talked about Colin Bundy. I recall when he became the VC at WITS, we had this joke that was doing the round. We used to call him the rice and the rice of the peasantry. I don't know whether you've read the work of Colin Bundy about the rice and the rice, of the peasantry. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's really my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'm really excited that a long-standing friend and colleague of, in fact, two of them, of Charles, that's Professor Karen Harris. And Karen, we are very excited that you are here with us. She was unwell, and only this morning I received a message saying, no, actually, I'll be there. And so we're really excited to have you here, Karen. And I know how much you care about Charles. I'm reminded of when we were trying to recruit Charles' assistant, the role that you played. Yeah. Then next to her is Professor Lois Mulambo, really one of the finest historians that we have around, I've always admired him since I got to know him. Long before I moved over to Pretoria, I would bump to him during these many meetings. I'm excited to know that, you'd be excited to know that Alois is now a senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. We are always teased because people insist that our place there is a retirement home. But so be it. If we are going to keep good scholars, why shouldn't we? So I'm really excited that Alois is part of us. Then I have Professor Tula Simpson, who is now the head of History Department. Oh, okay. Yeah. History Department. Doesn't like power. He's a very decent man, In Africa, when you're given power, they say power is eaten whole. You don't divide it, Yeah, because it's only those who hold the knife and the yam that, have the capacity to divide power. Tula, I'm quite excited. I met Tula on several occasions whenever they decided to call me in to help them with the rating applications, a very tedious process. That's the first time I met Tula. And, I'm excited that you are here. And then finally, Dr. Lindy Coates, also from the History Department. Please give them a round of hands. Yes, Karen is whispering to me that Tula will go first, and then can we follow that order? Yeah. Once they're done, Charles will respond. We'll give him the right of reply. We don't know what they're going to say. So he has to get the right of reply. And once he has done that, we'll have, Q&A. And after Q&A, we'll have one ritual and then refreshments. I won't tell you about the ritual. My secret. Okay. Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope the microphone is working. I'm not sure whether it is. Can I be heard at the back? Great, then that's great. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation, Peter, James as well, for this celebration of our greatest historian, as it stands, Professor Van Onselen, whose autobiography is central to the narrative of our discipline in this country. And I'm just interested in perhaps if he would be willing to indulge us in reflecting on certain aspects of his career and his biography, which I think are important for us historians in the present and also in the future as well, with regards to the present and future state of the discipline. One of the many aspects of his oeuvre, which it's even richer than Peter and James have indicated, which is his time as a social historian. In the early period of his career at Wits, there was a very ambitious project to develop out of social history a truly people's history which would contribute to transforming the country by enlisting ordinary South Africans as participants in generating a new historiography. Tremendously rich outreach programs through the history workshop program. I understand that one of the processes was one of his many great essays. Nobody's even mentioned New Babylon, New Nineveh, but there's a chapter in there, Randlords and Rotgut, which I think they produced a play out of it in order to try and reach out to the working class population of Johannesburg. And I was just wondering, our role, our concept of our place in history, it's a much less expansive one, it's a much more modest one. In fact, in many ways, we're losing our independence and our disciplinary craftsmanship. And I was just wondering what you were thinking of what role can, not what it does play, but what can it play in history, and how can our role as historians inform the task of trying to uplift this society, and what lessons perhaps you would have to offer to us based on that. Another very interesting aspect which I'm interested about is that many people who are part of the history workshop are trying to settle in their own minds publications. I was reading one yesterday from Clive Glazer and then also from Peter Delius as well, about E.P. Thompson and what he means to them. And I was just wondering whether that was a genealogy which you would be interested in speaking about. In all of these commentaries, the feedback is, yes, Thompson was an important person, but he didn't influence me personally. I was just wondering whether he had any particular role to play and how you envisaged rethinking the sort of structuralist approach to radical historiography and developing it in more interactive and social historical ways. You have spoken about, in the essay which we were given to prepare, the interview which we were given to prepare for today, about the triangle between life experience, structure, and process. These are obviously the main categories which we, as historians, have to speak about. You've tackled it in many ways over many different books over the years, and I was just wondering whether you had any reflections based on your mature opinion, having dealt with them, how you would integrate those three categories, and advice for future students who might be involved in doing similar things in the future. One of the great difficulties we face at the moment with regards to younger historians is that people are raised in a digital world where writing experience is very much limited to social media. And I think that the whole process of being productive as a historian and developing works, it's very difficult to know where to start. And I was just wondering, from one of the great masters who's managed to be extremely prolific and has managed to write a series of books which have managed to stand the test of time, something I've never asked, but I've always been curious to ask, and I'm going to be cheeky enough to ask it. What is your process with regards to writing books? How do you go about doing it? How do you discipline yourself? What are the tips and traps which you develop? And it's very practical minded. If you give us the tips, we will definitely pass them on with regards to our pedagogy for our new students. And another aspect of the, and then I'm closing down, we're coming to the finishing struck here. Another aspect is, my sense is that towards your more recent books, you are encouraging us to think of South Africa not just in terms of a regional whole, not limiting us to the demarcation of South Africa's borders, and not just limiting us to a south of the Zambezi narrative in a geographical sense. You're asking us to think about transnational connections of South Africa in the world and how we are connected. We're often asked in our national politics to think in very narrowly prescribed ethnic terms. What is the significance of global South Africanism to you, past, present, and what will our students learn by being asked to reimagine themselves in that sort of transnational and creative space? So yeah, those are all of my questions are about how your extraordinarily rich career can help us who are involved in the present and building for the future in terms of providing perspectives as far as that is concerned. But happy birthday, congratulations, and thanks again for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you to my colleagues. I decided, in reflecting on what Professor Charles van Onselen has meant to me as a student way back, something that he didn't know when my surname was still the maiden name of Thorpe. I wrote to him as one of Professor Chilome's students to inquire about something he'd written. And I actually got a reply all the way back from Johannesburg to Stellenbosch, where I was inquiring about the early trade unionists on the reef, which was part of my own master's study. But more importantly for him has been, besides the fact, the inspiration that Charles has given me personally in my own research, because of his focus on the people on the fringe, the people on the outside, and particularly with me focusing on a minority group, the Chinese, I've always been able to grasp at something that Charles has either written or said to justify what I'm doing. What I decided to do today was to rather reflect on what Charles has done in terms of my day-to-day teaching. We have over 1,000 first years doing history. And we weave Charles van Onselen into everything that we do. When we start out, the course that Alois and myself began so many years ago, we decided to introduce biography as a first research assignment for these little first years to do, to experiment with writing their own history of somebody. And I must say, it worked out very well. We've been doing it for 20-something years now. And the students are often inspired by that first bite at doing their own little bit of research on South African or African personality to carry on with history and eventually do honors, masters, and doctorate. So we start off with Kasmain and telling the students about this incredible history that has been written about this individual who almost lived to 100 years, and how through his eyes we get to know South African history. And so the biography that they do is a biography in context. And that is what Charles has done. It's not a story from cradle to grave. It's what he exposes us to through these incredible mastery of words to understand the past through the eyes of an individual. And so I flash on the screen, Kasmaini, tell them a little bit about that. And if they want something more juicy, I then have Fox and the Flies and Joseph Silver. And as Charles himself said, you need to read the book in the bottom of your garden with the big dog, and that inspires them. So we get them sort of hooked into that right from the get-go. And I must say it's been incredibly successful because these students are inspired by his writings, by the stories that he's telling, and by the history that is brought to life through the individuals that he's focused on. As my colleagues have already referred to, Nineveh and Babylon remains, to me, one of the greatest historical works ever written in this country. It crosses such an incredible landscape, and it brings so many bits and pieces of that Witwatersrand history to life. So when we teach that theme on the industrial and the mineral revolution that takes place in South Africa, our reader is riddled with extracts from Charles's Nineveh and Babylon, the place the workers made for themselves in the mines, and the stories of I almost said women, Washer Zulu men coming to the reef and servicing the reef. The prostitutes, the outliers, everybody is brought to life through that book. And then we move on to another one of my favorites, and that is Night Trains. And in a country that is so riddled with xenophobia at the time, this book was so timeless. To read about people, and as Tula already said, this transnational, the Southern Africanist part of the world, where suddenly students are made aware of not the single biography, but the biographies of people who were crushed literally in those mines, who came on that single train journey, as the book begins, saying, you know, that one train journey and what it encapsulated and what it was all about. And so again, an incredible chapter is opened up for students having a really one-sided view, but if they look to the extracts that we use from Night Trains, they get to see a whole new world. And again, the mastery of the way that Charles has written this book, it's one that you just can't put down. As I say, biography is integral to our first year teaching, but it goes way beyond that. At our honors level, we were fortunate to have Charles actually teach as part of our honors course when he arrived at UP in 1999, in the previous century. So did I, just for all confessions. And then to see how our students have been inspired by his incredible diagram that he used in peasant studies of the onion ring. I've had students writing biographies. We just had one on Mendel Levine, and she used Charles's whole theory and idea about going the layers of the onion ring to actually produce an absolutely brilliant biography on Aubrey Levine, the renowned Ward 22 individual's father, which turned out to be a fascinating history. I also have a student at the moment in the audience, in fact, who's also writing a biography of the first Cape archivist. And again, Charles has been an inspiration for that work. And then a student who has seen the light and come from the sciences to the social sciences, working on genetics. She had a master's in genetics, and then took Charles's Fox and the Flies and looked at it through a genetic lens to tell and look at what could be done to even further entrench what I do believe, and I always will believe, is Jack the Ripper. So the inspiration that Charles has given just within one department at one university and how many of our students have gained is really something that I want to applaud him for and thank him for. And there's never a lecture that I present in Southern African history at undergrad level where I'm not quoting from one of his many books. They all have leaflets in and I bring them out. And as James said, when I show them customary and I tell them, this is a traditional weapon, it could kill you, but read it, it's worth it, it'll inspire you. So Charles, on that note, I want to thank you so much for what you have done, not only for me personally, for over many years, but also for how you have inspired literally thousands of students with the work that you've done. And just by planting, excuse the pun, the seed in their first year, many of them have been inspired to carry on. And that is why we are the department, I think, which has the strongest postgraduate cohort in the country. So I want to thank you and acknowledge you for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me to be part of this. Karen has just said how Charles has inspired young scholars. I'm one of those. The first book I read was Chibaro, and that launched my career, so to speak, as a historian. And that book is still being used in university in Zimbabwe as we speak. But I'll come back to that later on. I thought since the theme was biography, autobiography, and writing history, I might just spend a few minutes looking at how Charles has handled biographies and as part of history, and the skills that is brought to bear in that endeavor. Not everybody can write a good biography. It takes special skills to be able to produce a book like Showdown at the Red Lion, which is one of Charles' productions, that looks at the life of a criminal known as Jack McLaughlin in South Africa. A biography technically is just the story of an individual's life, but it is a story of an individual's life in a historical context. So that biography and history, for me, I think are intertwined. They're mutually supporting. So for you to be able to write a good biography, you need to know something about the historical context of that individual, where they were born, how they grew up, and what was going on around them. But for you to understand history, you also have to look at individual biographies, so that there is a symbiotic relationship, I think, between these two. So I will just highlight what I think are some of the very impressive aspects of Charles' ability to write biographies by looking at Showdown, if I may. So we said biography is the study of an individual's life. And we do have a very rich, very complex, very detailed history of Jack McLaughlin, born in Manchester in the middle of the 19th century in an industrial area, which was occupied mostly by Irish people who have got their own attitudes towards the English that they live among. It's a very rough neighborhood with a toxic masculinity that leads to gang warfare, to heavy drinking, to crime. Eventually, this individual decides he wants to leave England, and he joins the army, and he is therefore given free passage to Australia. And from there, he makes his way into South Africa. And in South Africa, he then leaves the military and becomes a full-time criminal, and is involved in all kinds of skirmishes with the law until he commits a heinous crime of killing 2 people at the Red Lion. He escapes to go to Australia for a while until he's arrested there, and then is taken back to South Africa and is eventually executed. I think 1910, was it? Yeah. So we've got this storyline of an individual. We know where he was born, we know how he grew up, we know how he ended up doing what he's doing. But for us to appreciate that, we need to know what was going on around him. This is where I think Charles is a master. Because in looking at the history of this one individual, we learn so much about the world around him at the time, in ways that actually make biography a window into a very complex historical world. We know that the reason he is able to travel to Australia through the army is that this is a period of the Industrial Revolution, which has brought in all kinds of technological changes in the mode of transport. The steamship is reigning supreme. The railway is becoming more widespread. There is the invention of the telegraph, which makes communication much faster. The newspapers are also coming into play. Therefore, we're talking of a globalization process that is taking place at a much faster pace than ever before. I know we normally talk about globalization as something recent that is associated with the IT revolution, but I think, as he says as he shows in his book, globalization has been around for a very long time. And this is one phase of the 19th century, late 19th century, that he's focusing on. So he's able to move to Australia and then to South Africa precisely because of this technological revolution. So starting with the individual, we are already beginning to look at the world, global world, in terms of technological revolution. This is also a period of mass emigration, particularly from England, as people move to Australia or South Africa and to other different parts of the empire in search of opportunities, particularly the discovery of minerals in South Africa and other places is a draw card for many of these people who are moving out. The interesting issue, however, is that this great migration that is facilitated by these technological changes that are taking place also facilitates the establishment of criminal networks throughout the empire. So that Jack, the Irish boy, he links up with other criminals in Australia and in South Africa who are Irish and become part of that international criminal network. Therefore, we've got the particular leading us to the general. But there's also a context that we need to focus on, which is the South African context. We've looked at the global context. South Africa This is the period that sees the Boer Republic of the Transvaal coming under pressure from British imperialism, that then leads to the Anglo-Boer War that results in the Union in 1910. But it's also a period of flux, particularly in Johannesburg, with the mineral revolution underway, a lot of crime, a lot of prostitution and those kinds of things, which make it possible for Jack to thrive as a criminal in South Africa. So what we have here is the individual story and the context, both in terms of the globe, in terms of the local, which are fused together in a very, very interesting manner. For you to be able to do this, that's why I said at the beginning, not everybody can write a good biography. You need to have very good research skills. The details that we have of Jack from the book that I'm describing are absolutely fascinating. And you wonder sometimes how Charles was able to get to this information. I've always thought that part of Charles' skills is being a forensic scientist. He's a historian, but the ability to dig up material and to piece it together into a narrative is something I've always admired. So research skills are absolutely essential. Then finally, you have to be a good storyteller. And I think Charles is one of the best storytellers I've come across. Because reading his book, it's like you're reading a novel. You keep wanting to turn the page to find out what happened next. So the message to all up-and-coming historians is that history does not have to be dull. History can be made exciting, and I think he has demonstrated just how you can do it. And now, as a way of just concluding my observations, we are told frequently, as scholars, you need to be using interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approaches. That's the in thing now. And people talk about that as if it is something that is entirely new. I go back to 1976, his first book that I read, Jibaro, which was a look at African mine labor in southern Rhodesia between 1900 and 1933. And I argue that that book is as multidisciplinary as they get. Way back then, because he employs economics, he employs politics, he employs sociology, he employs psychology, he employs anthropology. They're all part of that package. So anybody who aspires to be a good historian of Charles' caliber is to keep all these skills and requirements and perspectives in mind. So that young boy who started 40, 50 years ago down the road of history was inspired by you, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel very honored to be here. And Charles, I've embarrassed you in front of other people so many times, so I'm going to do it again. Can't help myself. It normally begins when it's happened at a few times that I've ended up at a lunch next to him with people who I believe do not appreciate him enough. And then I begin telling them what an influence he was on my formation as a historian. And then I can see the deep embarrassment as it settles on him. And unfortunately, you're in for a repeat. So my first experience of Charles was as a third-year student at the old Rand Afrikaans University. I don't think anyone from Wits ever put their feet there willingly. You had to be dragged to that, down there to Auckland Park. But we were given essays from New Babylon and New Nineveh as part of our third-year course. It also went into our honors course. And that was a form of writing I had not been exposed to before. That kind of social history, but also, Charles, the sense of place, which I think is a thread throughout all of your works, and it's also something that needs to be appreciated. that from there on, I then discovered you as a biographer. But as far as I was concerned, you're the absolute opposite to the kind of biography that I was trying to write. Because whereas you write about people on the margins, I was interested in the old white men at the center of power. The kind of history that the Wits History Workshop had shunned. And as I got into the readings on the Wits History Workshop and history from below, one of my favorite quotes, and sorry, even if it's a bit straw-manish, I love taking this quote from Shula Marx, in which she more or less rallied against this idea of history as the history of great men, and especially the history of great white men, and the idea that individuals can shape history, because that's not what the history workshop was about. It was about looking not just history from below, but history as processes and histories as these great forces, and having class as an analysis. And instead, in her words, history being subject to the whims and fancies of individuals. And that makes it complicated when you start digging into this individual and seeing them in their place. And whenever I looked at your work, I thought of it as using the individual as a lens for wider processes. But that's not exactly that. And then I realized the irony of your work, because biography became unfashionable. By the time I began working on biography in the early 2000s, there were only 2 South African historians I could clearly point to as biographers, both of them in this room today. You and Alex Mouton. You were my only examples. And I realized, today biography is fashionable. Everyone's doing it. No one was doing it back then. And the fact that you were actually subversive, in a sense, not just by overturning the great man history, but you do it through the great man medium. You use biography in order to show these great processes. So, ironically, I think biography is, microhistory is also what one could call it, but biography was supposed to be the genre of the elite, which you turned into something else, which I think was crucial. And then you did become my example in terms of how you write. And that was a formative experience. When I was a PhD student at Stellenbosch, you came and gave a master class. And the takeaway I took from that evening, you said many things and they were extremely interesting, but there was something I held on to. You said historians don't read enough. And we don't read enough literature. We don't read enough novels. And in order to be a good writer, you have to be a reader. And from there on, I made a point of reading as much literature. Well, of course, I read it before, but even more with an eye to being a storyteller. And from there on, if I open up a biography and I see sections and subsections and headings, you just realize this person has lost the plot. They've lost the narrative. And historians don't pay enough attention to narrative. I think we pay lip service to it, but you don't. And then you have this false dichotomy of popular biography versus scholarly biography. And then you have all the, walk into any bookshop now, and the shelves will be filled with biographies by journalists and, we'd call it amateur historians. And then the argument would be, well, those are accessible. Academic historians don't write accessibly. And I always look at yours, and I think you got it both ways. You got the deep research, and you write it accessibly. So at no point should we ever underestimate the reading public and think they cannot digest the work of a true professional scholar, as long as it is presented in a beautiful way, which you do. That just shows me that is the ideal we need to strive towards. We need to strive more towards not just the research, of course, that is a given, but the writing. We need to pay more attention to that. And in that also, the sense of place that I mentioned before. The last thing I want to leave, what I want to end off with, biography it forces you to try and live through the eyes of another individual. And in conversations with you, that's something I picked up. And I think that's the other crucial component of being a good historian and being a good biographer, is the quality of empathy. And that has been my experience of you so far, as a deeply humane, deeply empathetic individual. And that is imbued in all of your work. And thank you for that.
Incredibly wonderful. Really, thank you all for sharing these wonderful reflections on Charles' work. As Karen talked about the night trains, I couldn't help but reflect on the recent drama on Adesina. You remember the drama of this so-called Nigerian woman who wanted to compete? You remember her? And as I think this morning when I was looking at the night trains and reflected on the movement of migrant laborers from Mozambique, back then, before Industrial Revolution. And I kept asking myself, what if the grandfather or the grandmother, maternal side, worked in the South African mines? And the great-great-granddaughter is now being tormented and made to feel as an outsider. It's only books written by people like Charles. Alois has talked about the depth of narrative and the storytelling that he brings to bear on what he tells us. I'm a literary scholar, and I know only too well what storytelling is all about. When we were growing up, we were made to think. You remember the Aristotelian tension between historians and literary scholars? History is about facts, and literature is about fiction, striving for the sublime. And later on comes Hayden White and reminds us that, in fact, we all deploy narrative, the story. That the only way, and I always remind my students that the first tool ever given to humanity, was the story. That's the only way you organize meaning, through the story. In literature, we call it emplotment. In fact, a mathematician told me that even scientists actually tell stories. They may use very different symbols. Charles, I want to welcome you to respond to this wonderful. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. You should be very careful about what you take away from this, especially since one is looking at someone's birthday. Now, what happens when you have a birthday is you get older. So you move from 75 to 80, and it's accretive. And of course, as you age, you become more stupid, incoherent, so it comes down. Your IQ comes down. And when you're 80, you're at that serendipitous point where your age in chronological terms reflects your IQ. And so you should be very careful about what you take away from this. But let me start, first of all, by saying thank you all for coming. I appreciate you giving your time and coming to listen to this. Let me start by paying some rent, which I do very, very gladly because I'm a tenant. The University of Pretoria took me in when the University of the Witwatersrand didn't want me. It didn't want me because I had asked awkward questions about an African intellectual at the university. And the university, in its brilliant liberal form, of course, had double standards for how it would deal with white miscreants and how it dealt with African miscreants. And I was unhappy with that, and the University of Pretoria took me in. The Vice-Chancellor at that time was Johan van Zyl. Instrumental in bringing me here was a Deputy Vice-Chancellor who used to be at Wits called June Sinclair. And she was instrumental in bringing a whole cohort of Wits people who were angered by the double standards of white male liberals and wanted to find a relatively independent place where they could continue their work. So Nikki Binnerdell, who became to run Gibbs, came from Wits. The wonderful Keith Bevan, who ran the geography department, came from Wits. And so did many, many others. And we were made to feel welcome here. And it's an old story of universities. This is the story of Oxford and Cambridge. Not that Pretoria and Wits would pass as Oxford or Cambridge, but are aspirant Oxfords and Cambridges in a different setting. And the movement of scholars for conflict is an old one. And one has to understand that background in order to understand part of this institution, and certainly where I came in there. James, can I just get some water there? Thanks. Now, so I want to thank those predecessors. I also want to thank all my colleagues, and especially the colleagues in the Department of History through the wonderful Professor Harris. I was made to feel at home in this university via the Department of History from the very get-go. And I'm greatly in their debt, not only to Karen, but to others and the early support they gave me and my work. I was also lucky enough to be in the Center for the Advancement of Science, and both the directors that I've worked under are here in the form of Robin and, of course, James. Now, directors come in all sizes and shapes, and what really marks good directors of research institutes is the ability to understand who to work with and who to encourage and who to push in a narrow sense, and who to leave alone. And there lies a great distinction for success of research institutes. And I was singularly blessed in that first Robin, and then later James, with his own great wisdom, knew this is not a person you want to be involved with. This is not a person you should fiddle with. This is a person trying to do some research and writing, and allow them to do that. This is an incredible skill, and I'm deeply in both of these people's debt for that. I'm also in debt, of course, to the staff, to Kirsty, to Rose, and others in the center who facilitate my work. And I've always been extremely lucky in having some really wonderful assistants who have helped me to be as productive as I am. Cecilia Jacobs, we lost during COVID, and she was my strength in many years. I now have the wonderful Cecilia Kruger, who has been helping me in an exemplary fashion. And I can only do what I do because other people assist me. People say, you wrote a book. There's no one who wrote a book. There are always people who write a book. And that's true of most intellectual endeavors. And lastly, let me say thank you to all the people on the panel here today. I'm moved and touched by several of your observations, which are very astute. I'll pick up on one or two of the points, but I'm sufficiently arrogant and narcissistic to just talk about other things. So you'll forgive me if I don't go in detail and respond to in response to you. The space that was accorded to me has allowed me to be extremely productive. All in all, I think I've written about a dozen books, but there are about 7 that have come out directly from the period that I've been at the University of Pretoria. And if you want to do mechanical sums, which increasingly mindless managers of universities want, and the incredibly stupid departments of education love, I've produced a book roughly once every 45, 42 months. in my time here. And that's not about me, it's about the circumstances in which I'm allowed to do my work and benefit from. And of course, you have to accept and understand that current company, no doubt excluded, university managers are increasingly stupid, increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly in bed and incestuous. And the South African universities are in a very bad shape. Every one of these wretched universities will now tell you how when they have a leadership change and they are advertising, we're going global, we will search the world, we're going to be globally competitive. Just look at the appointments of vice-chancellors over the last 6 months at leading institutions. They checked out the world, they looked everywhere, and then you know what happened? They found the next vice-chancellor in the office down the passage. How incredible to think that such wit, such intelligence, such brilliance, such managerial and administrative competence was living down the passage when you were looking elsewhere. No, the real answer is we're a bunch of mindless nationalists, and we're so scared of appointing outsiders in our leading institutions that we're now becoming increasingly incestuous. And it is the mark of decline of universities when they point from within their own ranks. It is not a sign of distinction. And when people move from Cape Town to Johannesburg, or Johannesburg to Cape Town, or Bloemfontein to Durban, or Durban to Cape Town, this is a warning sign. It's a sign of increasing stupidity and incestuous intellectual behavior. And of course, quite often now, if you look at the universities, you'll also find that its administrative ability, its managerialism. Try and find a scholar amongst the vice-chancellors. Try and find a scholar, one who has really done creative, imaginative, intellectual work. You won't find it, because what we want is bean counters. That's the background against which you all have to work, and you should be aware of it, and you should struggle against it. Now, in my own work, in looking back at these books, I think what I've tried to do, Karen, as a historian, is I've tried to say, I refuse to be bound by the discipline in its narrowly defined sense. My job as a historian is to test various genres, everything from biography. I'm cast largely as a biographer here. Yeah, it's a title which I can live with. But I want to push the boundaries of genre. I want to be able to write biography. I want to be able to write economic history. I want to write social history. I want to write political. I want to write history without bounds. And I want to do this in an imaginative and a creative way. And so I want to have a wide range. I want to be able to work with different tools. And so what I've tried to do historically is I've used particular modes of research. The Kasma in a book is based on oral history. It's for me the ultimate test, taking an African farmer who was at very best semi-literate, but largely illiterate, and to capture his life by talking and involving him. And I was very fortunate in finding a man who had infinite wisdom, highly articulate, absolutely brilliant, who was very patient with me. So when I tried oral history, it wasn't me, it was the brilliance of the person that I was talking to that makes that book a substantial book. And again, it's deceitful. You know, when I get credited for the seed of mine, it's lovely, I'll take it, I want it every day, and if you want to put money in the book, that's fine too. But you should know that it's partly the brilliance of my subject. It's the subject that enriches me. It's the subject that taught me, and I was the mere vehicle for this. Now, early on, lots of these attempts of mine, I was powerfully influenced by, and Tula, this just touches on, you know, and it doesn't do justice to your question. I was brought up intellectually in a Marxian tradition. And that's a very self-conscious, deliberate choice on my part. South Africa is a rat hole. It's a rat hole of predetermined cultural and racial categorizations. And one of the joys of Marx and Marxism is that it looks at structure and process and an industrial revolution, which is what this country was undergoing through, and says there are different ways than simply seeing identity politics, by simply looking at a person's gender, by simply looking at their color, by simply allocating the thing on the basis of skin color and culture. Marxism gives you something. If societies are assembled in these different ways, Marxism gives you a way of pulling through with different categories and interrogating. You can interrogate whatever you like: a person, a culture, a gender, a group of activists. And Marxism's great strength is that if it's used properly, it's non-racial, okay? And it enables you to move in a way. Now, in a country that's obsessed with race, to the point where it's a terminal intellectual problem, to have devices and tools which can interrogate in a different way rather than taking race at face value. That doesn't mean race does not matter. You'd have to be mad to think that race does not matter in this, the champion racist society of the late 20th century. You'd be mad to ignore race, but you'd be equally mad to take race on its own terms and deal with things only as if they are racial. You have to ask other questions about that. So be very wary of race as a category. And that's why Marxism had that appeal to me. Now, when you look at the books as a whole, you know, publishers, and someone like Rosemary will know this, novelists will tell you, and reviews and literary critics, that quite often the first novel is autobiographical. It's very difficult to escape from yourself. And I think for historians, the same thing is true, because we deal with narrative, we deal with literature, we're trying to make ourselves rounded individuals, okay? So the thing, some of your works are autobiographical. You are drawing on your own life experience and things. Don't pretend that history is some sort of 19th century Rankian pure pseudoscience. It's bollocks. History is not science. That doesn't mean it can't use scientific method, that it can't be informed by rigor and discipline and chronology. But it is not a science. And when you see the word social science, you should also be very, very careful about the social part and the science part of that. And of course, universities now increasingly put trash in many of the social sciences. And so there's some disciplines, I better not name them, which are best off a university campus. And these are caring, sharing, loving, empathetic disciplines. Be very careful of caring, sharing, loving disciplines. They lack intellectual rigor, and they shouldn't be on university campuses. Anyhow, part of my works come out of autobiography. I grew up in mining towns. I grew up in mining villages. I went to school in mine things with immigrants who came from Scotland and various other terrible places, Fraser. The sort of Bantustans of Europe. And so some of these works of mine are autobiographical, is another way of looking at them, Lindy. If you look at Chibaro, it's about mine compounds, as Alois alluded to. And that's because I lived next door to what were industrial prisons. Africans were taken, and African men being confined in what are industrial prisons. And no one asked what goes on in there. How did that happen? To what extent are these people subject to the law, to racism, to big business, to capitalism, actually? And to what extent can they create and make their own world? Now, there are a whole set of questions there that are very exciting. So, Chibaro is about my childhood. New Babylon and New Nineveh, I was farmed out because my father was a policeman and moved around. I had to live for long periods of time with my grandmother in Fordsburg and Mayfair in Johannesburg. And these were working class suburbs, okay? So New Babylon and New Nineveh were again me in my little restricted white world, saying, but, you know, there's an Irishman down the road There's a Jewish trader here. There's an Indian shopkeeper over there. How did all these guys get together in a mining town? And the most important question for me in those books was, how did you stay out of the mines? Everything was owned by the mines. Everything's run by mining capital. The whole world is shaped by them. What about the people who don't go there? And to what extent is that conscious resistance, and to what extent is it just life? So that's, Peter, where the prostitutes comes, where the landlords and rotcut come from. It's from seeing and viewing it. And equally well, the night trains. It grows out of mines, and me seeing African workers coming in trains, of which the last coach is a prison. It's a cell in which they've locked insane people who've gone insane on the mines are being transported back to Mozambique in a cell. What sort of society does that? And how can you not interrogate that? And what is it about African historians who are very keen, and rightly so, on oppression, on marginalization, on the impact of imperialism and colonialism, that they can't see this train and write it up? Why does it need an old white man to write this up? What's wrong with you? Why don't you wake up? Why don't you ask some other questions? So that's the autobiographical part. Of the pure biographical part, it really goes to another thing, and it goes to about psychohistory. As Peter said, amongst many, the backbone of the BSc was actually geology, but I also did some psychology. And you can see this constant thread of trying to understand people, empathize, work out what are their mental terrains, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and what are their pathologies. And if you look at the Fox and Fires, it's straight out of psychiatric history. It's straight out of psychiatric history, and it's psychological. It says, here was a psychopath. This is how he inserted himself in the world. This is how he preyed on women. This is how these women were marketed around the world in capitalist terms, using transport, the telegraph, harnessing all capitalist tools that were being used by industry for purely criminal purposes. Likewise, in terms of biography, when we look at the small matter of the horse, when I first came across this extraordinary man who'd set up prison gangs, is the father of all prison gangs that still exist now. And his experience grows directly out of racism, social marginalization, and a sense of injustice. And that's what drives this man. Now, injustice in colonial imperial South Africa for blacks is almost synonymous with a black experience. So, but here, under the most adverse conditions, was a man who created his own world within the prisons and tried to shape and to organize people in a dignified way. Now, you have to think about the distinction here. Prison is designed to isolate, marginalize, humiliate, and someone's turning this upside down, saying, how can I make this strong and dignity? It's the same set of questions that come if you've got half a wit, and we're still waiting for the book to write about Robben Island. And Robben Island, not written as grand triumphalist African nationalist politics. This is what Walter did. This is what Madiba did. This is what Harry Gwala did. Yes, of course. Of course. You can do that and write it and respect it. But it's much more interesting to ask psychological questions about what makes an extraordinary man like Mandela survive this. I think many African nationalists are still struggling with what he did, and as you can see, young ones who haven't lived through it dismiss him as being a sellout and a collaborator. What you really need to do is go back at Robben Island and look at some psychological histories of those who were there, and those who were creative, and those who were compassionate, and those who were forgiving, and those who went the other way. There's a whole different way of seeing Robben Island, writing about it. Now, this also means, even though I'm interested in structure and process, this also means the terrible thing for Marxists is, and Marxism is a deeply infected flawed system of analysis. It is a system of analysis, it's a theory, but it's not boundless, and it's not God, and it's not the Bible. It's a guide. The thing is, for Marxists, their big problem is they constantly look at the economic base, and they read off politics, and they read off society, and they read off culture. And this is an extremely dangerous and bad thing to do. So constantly, if you're trying to write in a Marxian way, and I still try and write in a Marxian way, there's not a book of mine that will not start directly or indirectly with what is the economic base, who is benefiting from this, where does profit lie, and how is this institution assembled. But if you just look at that, you start losing human agency. And when you use human agency, you might as well give up writing history. Because history is about how do people make history, and how does history make people. And unless you're constantly at the cutting edge, you will start producing nonsense and rubbish, or self-indulgent stuff. So the real test is how you can reconcile the person working in history and its forces, which means you've got to look at plenty of disciplines, are playing out in the person and giving you some historical structure. Now, the influences on the Marxian thing, Tula, this comes from a whole cohort, some of whom you will never have heard of, and you will never hear of, unless you go to the library. And one of the oldest and earliest ones of these was a man called Morris Dobb. Old style, 1930s British communist, hard communist, but an inspired historian, absolutely inspired historian, who wrote some brilliant social and economic history of Britain. And then in a later generation, that's absolutely true. It's E.P. Thompson, and it's the person I was privileged to correspond with in the form of Eric Hobsbawm, and several others of that generation. And then, because I have such a powerful, visceral reaction against South African exceptionalism, it makes me sick when I read history and say, well, South Africa's exceptional, South Africa's different. South Africa is different. Well, of course, all things are different at one level. The question is not how are they different, it's how similar it is. And if racial oppression and exploitation of blacks is as profound and deep as we know and think it is in South Africa, why don't we pay more attention to the history of slavery in America? And so I constantly was reading, especially, again, a man who became a friend of mine, Eugene Genovese, who wrote the classics, several of the classic works on American slavery. Because if you take South Africa and its racial oppression, in its gender dimension, in its rural and its urban dimensions, why can't you learn from American slavery? There's nothing that's happened to black South Africans that hasn't happened in Kenya, that it hasn't happened in Nigeria, that it hasn't happened in Sierra Leone, and that hasn't happened in a slave situation in America. But because we're so nationalist, because we love national boundaries so much, because we love nationalism, which is a sign of terminal stupidity in a country which has a large, quote-unquote, colored population, an African majority, a significant white minority, and a rich, intellectually, religiously, and culturally other groupings like Indians and Chinese, as Karen knows. You want a narrow, ethnically, racially based nationalism in a country that's manifestly multicultural and multiracial. So your duty ethically, your duty politically, your duty as a historical thing is to tease and try and break nationalism, break this narrow, selfish idea of within these geographical boundaries, we are so special. We are so wonderful. No, you're not. No, you're not. It's not even, doesn't start to be a country. It can't look after its borders. It has no police force. It's dysfunctional. Why would you want to write a national history confined by borders? Why would you want to do that? Instead, why don't we look at it and say, imperialism and colonialism invaded the whole of Central Africa, if we can, of Southern Africa and South Central Africa. Why will we take the colonialist and imperialist boundaries, especially for African nationalists? Who gave you these boundaries? It's the imperialists, it's the colonialists, but you take them. You love it. You love being South Africa. You love being xenophobic. You love being saying you're different from Zimbabweans, from Kenyans, from anybody else. Are you mad? Are you mad? Why are you doing that? Look at the everyday social life. Look at our political history. Our first trade unions come from Clemens Kadali. They come from a Malawian. We have a rich tradition of drawing on regional African enterprise, vision, and creativity. And yet we write history as if we have to write it for Shoshanguve. Why do you do that? Why do you do that? You know, we have so much to learn from Central Africa, from East Africa and West Africa, that we need to constantly interrogate what it means to write history with and without boundaries. With and without boundaries. If you want to write a history of the South African police and its pathological dimension, the security police, all right, you better look at national boundaries, because it was assembled in a national way with a national project and with nationalist outcomes that were racist, oppressive, and murderous. But if you're looking at mine labor, if you're looking at patterns of African literature, if you're trying to understand sociology and how real life works, we get a lady who puts herself up for a beauty contest, and people then start digging away to work out that her father was Nigerian or not. I can't remember the particular name. And you look at it and you're appalled. Why can't we embrace this person and take this person? Why don't we see the enriching features of this? Instead, we want your pedigree. You want your pedigree, and the pedigree for her to enter a beauty contest, which is another lunacy. The pedigree for her is, has she got Nigerian blood in her? Well, well, well. Does that make you automatically stupid? Does it make you ugly? What is it about in a beauty contest if your father was Nigerian? You have to be a nation of idiots. You just have to be. And we're pretty long way down that road. Now, just let me quickly answer a couple of questions. Tula, I think you touch on important questions about history, not only as a discipline, as a profession, but how it situates in the society. And at the moment that those things happened with History Workshop and elsewhere, was a unique moment. It was a unique historical moment in the sense that we could see that liberation was coming. It was coming slowly, and we wanted to be involved in those processes, not in a party political way. Not in a party political way, but in an empathetic way, trying to capture ordinary experiences of white, black, colored, Asian South Africans. And that's what History Workshop was about. Now, of course, we've internalized the nationalism, and we've internalized our xenophobia. We love our national boundaries. And instead of doing outreach, imaginative, creative history writing, saying, Nigerians have got something, even Kenyans maybe, I'm not sure about the Kenyan case, have something to contribute to for us. Why do we not embrace this? Why do we not do that? Why don't we stress how multiracial and increasingly multi-ethnic, multicultural we're becoming? That's, when you talk about quote-unquote nation building, it's the tool of half-witted politicians, and it's instrumental. And it's narrowing, and it feeds xenophobia. If someone says to you, I'm doing something about nation building, run for the exit. Here comes big trouble. So we've got to try and find, Tula, a project which is relevant to the current social and economic problems. And as historians, we must write good history. That's the first job. Don't be an activist in Shoshanguve. You want to be an activist, go there and do it. But don't confuse activism and writing disciplined professional history. And you yourself have done this by knowing and concentrating and producing, a first-class overview. And you're not confused about these things. The confusion comes when the nationalists want to give you the kiss of life and say, write national history. Oh, I love it. I see you've written about a letter X or Y political faction, or Z political party. Big trouble, big trouble. Watch out for that. So I think one of the things we can do, and one of the things that tries to inform me, is I had a visceral dislike and hatred of Afrikaner nationalism. It's the politics of Braille. You just have to run your finger across it and you know this is a stupid, racist, ethnocentric, selfish project that will end in destruction. Okay? So your job is, if you find nationalists, is to tease them, to mock them, to write history that questions them, to force them to think through more supple and open formulations of nationalism that transcend boundaries. One of the jobs of a historian and younger historians is constantly to break. Constantly interrogate, constantly break. If you find a mainstream thing and you find history writing going in one direction, be very careful. There isn't only one path to truth. Truth can be approached from 360 degrees. Anyhow, that's my feel about it. Now, on the biography part, Karen, you're absolutely right, and as I think I've tried to explain to you how some history writing comes out of self and self-experience, and hopefully it enriches it. You know, it depends on how you view yourself and what you took from those experiences. And the nice thing for historians, including for young African historians, there's not a single part of the country, there's not a single part of where you came from that's not worthy of a history. There's not a member of your family that's not worth a history. It's how you see it, how you cast it, how you read it, and how universal you make it, and how particular you make it. Those are the skills that are required. So don't be frightened about looking at your backyard and say, oh, I just grew up in Limpopo. It's not very boring. It's not very interesting. No, it's absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And if there are parts of it that you find boring or tedious or manipulative or repressive, make that the strength of what you're writing, not the weakness of what you're writing. Alois, that was a spectacularly sensitive reading of Showdown. Thank you very much, sir. And that for me also was part of biography. It was me testing genre. And of course, as you point out, some of this plays out in New Zealand, some of it plays out in Australia, some plays out in Ireland, it plays out in England. It's me mocking boundaries. It's mocking boundaries, saying he has a human being and a human experience. Do I want to write this as the biography of an Irishman? No. Is he Irish? Yes. Is that important? Yes, in all sorts of ways. In the same way that him being Catholic is important. But is that the only way for encapsulating the man's life and all the places he went to? No. No, it's manifestly not. So what one's trying to do, and that's your point, about being sensitive to ideas and to being sensitive about religion, and the world of ideas and philosophies and political ways of mobilizing. Lindy, I think those are very lovely subversive points about you, and I think you've got my number. I'm trying to use biography as a tool of subversion. I want to subvert nationalism. I want to subvert great men history. I want to subvert structure and process of the formal structures in society. I want to be incendiary. I want to be destructive. I want to break things. But once you've used all these things and you've broken them and you've presented an alternative, surely it's creative and it's constructive. If you give someone a model for how to do something, that's the excuse for having been intellectually a rogue and a vandal and an arsonist. And, you know, because I have a split personality, I want to be an incendiary and a criminal and an arsonist, but I also want discipline and rigor and tightness in what I do. So that's my take, and thank you very much for stimulating some of those ideas. Thank you all very much for coming. That's what I think I've done, and as I warned you, watch out for the 80 thing. Thank you.
Yes. I also warned you to expect something. And thank you, Charles. Really incredible, you know. To confess, I also started as a Marxist. So there's something. Yes. Yeah, it's always, that's where you start, you know, and it's, in many ways, it forces you also to read, you know, those great, you know, classics. I'm going to open up this session for, you know, a few questions, and before we move into our refreshment. I'm sure some of you might have a few things to raise, and then I will invite my former boss to close the meeting. I worked very closely when I was at Wits with an old man called Eskia Mfalele, and he founded the Department of African Literature and African and Comparative Literature. And when he left, African literature had become a full-fledged department. So I wrote him a note to say that I have taken over as the head of department. And he wrote back to me, said, James, sit on the chair firmly, but don't sit as if there's fire under your chair. And many leaders do that. They sit, you know, on some of those chairs as if there's fire. They're so restless. I'll tell you more about that when I'm introducing Robin. Any questions? Yes. I see two, one, two. Kasti, can you, there?
My name is Tumelo Marema from the Department of Jurisprudence. I first want to thank Professor van Onselen for the lot that you've given us today to think about, but also for the work that you've provided and the books that you've written. It's not only important for historians, but also for us people outside of history. I happen to be part of the young people who you speak about who call Mandela a sellout. And I draw actually from what Gail Gerhardt calls the orthodox nationalists of the 1950s. But my question really is, so Machiavelli says one of the ways in which to conceal conquest, to conceal the fact of appropriating political power or ruling power through the use of force, is to hide the fact that political power was taken through force and through scholarship and academia create some sort of right. And my question then is, what do you think is the role of history in concealing the fact of conquest in South Africa and giving a narrative, a historical narrative, which focuses on the problem of racism as oppression or as discrimination or exclusion, but overlooking in the first place the authority to discriminate. So for instance, if you look at when you speak of the 1913 Land Act, and it speaks of dispossessing black people of their land, but it doesn't question the authority to even pass that law in the first place. So the question of sovereignty. And I think, so this question is directed to Professor van Onselen, but I'd also been interested, Chair, if you would allow me, in Professor Dr. Lindy Kort's answer, how she would respond to this. Thank you.
Let's take one or a couple of questions, then you can respond.
Is this thing working? In truth, I don't know what your question is. I found it very difficult to assemble the parts. But if you're saying to me, you should be sensitive to the structures of power and how the structures of power are portrayed, and how they're portrayed in history, and who makes use of that, then we're all pushing against the same door. I'm absolutely with you. Yes, those things need to be documented, exposed, and clinically done. How that relates to your preamble about the sellout, only you will know. You're going to have to help me a lot there. But I think you're absolutely right. You have to question how power is assembled. Who claims the legitimacy for it? And, you know, I think you're making a really wonderful point in this sense, that whatever you find as the conventional wisdom, not just for the sake of being contrary or difficult, comb it in the opposite direction. Don't stroke the cat of fact and interpretation only with the fur. Run your fingers in the opposite way and see what it reveals for you about texture, about time, and about place. So that seems to me to be the essence of what you're asking. And we're on the same side. Constantly question it, yes. But for historians also, be aware people will appropriate your story, your narrative, and I think that's embedded in your comments as well. And you have to be very sure that you've mothballed what you write against nationalists. Make life difficult for nationalists. If you've made life horrible for nationalists in a day, it's been a good day.
Is there a response there as well? Question.
It's working. Yes, I hope I understood your question correctly. So please correct me if I'm rambling off and it's not answering you. I think I agree with Charles. Make life difficult for nationalists. I do it by studying them all the time. They fascinate me because the more you study them, the more you understand how they function. The more you understand how they make their myths, how successful they are in propagating them. I mean, the irony of Afrikaner nationalism, which I spent years studying, is if you look at the nuts and bolts, they are always fighting amongst each other. There are power struggles and factions behind the scenes, but they are very successful in perpetuating this myth of a united nationalism, of a united front. I think it's like the best way to demythologize them is to study them in detail. And I think that's also what biography is very useful for, you know, having a person as a lens to take that apart. Also, yes, I agree with Charles. You have your structures, you have your processes, and it's extremely important to study those. But sometimes when you are studying power, you get to a group of individuals who are able to make decisions that affect the lives of millions. And then you get into the nitty-gritty to see how they did that. In terms of their legitimacy, the fact that they are here in the first place, how do they do that? How do they establish that position? That's our job as historians, to trace that and not to do it through mythologizing, actually to understand, you know, again, the devil is very often in the detail, in the process, but I think also in the individuals, the ones who have access to power. I think access to power is also one of the very important strands in our historical analysis. I'm not sure if that answers you though, but if it doesn't, then you can corner me afterwards and we can discuss it further.
We can talk about it if you are not satisfied during the line.
Thank you. My name is Fraser. I'm in anthropology. Three things. Firstly, happy birthday, young man. I wish you many, many more. Secondly, to pick up on something that Karen said on the use of the night trains. So in anthropology, we also use the night trains. We should actually have a chat to make sure we're not using the same chapters to let the students off too lightly. And I think you'll be happy to know that I use it for the 500 first years as a wrecking ball into ideas of nationalism that students take completely for granted. And it blows their mind sometimes. It's a really powerful piece of work. It's easy for first years to read. And then to build on that, to really blow up ideas of nationalism. Sometimes they react really violently against it, which is great. So the last thing is I want to ask your advice. I recently got a book proposal accepted by Bloomsbury to write a history of reggae music in Southern Africa through the life history of a specific musician, a guy called Colbert Mukwebo, from the previous homeland of Venda. And like you said, a lot of history and anthropology actually is biography. So I've been the rhythm guitarist in this guy's band for almost 20 years. But there's also a lot going on in terms of reggae. I mean, a lot of reggae musicians in the Caribbean sung about apartheid, a lot of reggae music, and this guy, as far as I can see, Colbert Mukwebo, was the first musician to record reggae music in South Africa in 1972. And we're supporting a group called Burning Spear in Joburg next month. So he's still at the top of his game. How the hell do I go about doing this?
Very carefully. I wouldn't, Fres, I'd like to be able to give you some great wisdom and insight, but I can't. It's the sort of issues that I was talking about there, about establishing the quotidian, the everyday, in order as a baseline, in order to heighten how exceptional your man is. So without sketching out why reggae took either long or shorter to get here, is to understand the potential catchment area and how someone as gifted as that can spot a gap and can take the gap and say, I can do something creative here for other purposes. So yes, by all means, foreground and write about the achievements of your musician and reggae and his abilities. But I think you have to research extremely carefully what it is about his audience, what sort of music they were listening to, and why, when he did start, it could start resonating. For me, that's always fascinating. Why would an exogenous and an exotic form start to find some root here? Because we're talking about common humanity, we're talking about music, we're talking about psychological and social cadence as captured in music, in theater, in dance. And those are the universals. But what is it, which part of the universals are brought to the fore at what stage? That's for me the question. That's not helpful.
Can I have permission to email you and put your brains on it?
You can try. The old days of answering Karen, those are past.
Thank you. I don't have a particular question for you, Prof. I want to thank you, if that's okay. Colleagues, I'm probably one of the last of your honors students that sat at your feet and learned from you a whole semester. Those teachings have gone far. And I liked how you spoke about biography in particular, because I'm working the notion of history writing from an asset-based point of view, as opposed to the traditional trying to fill the gap, the Lucania here and filling in all the spots, but actually bringing the experiences of ordinary people into the moment and how they shaped and are affected by history. So it's history from an asset base and not a deficit-based approach. And I find it very particularly interesting because it does allow you to disrupt the dominant narrative by actually foregrounding the roles and contributions of the individual. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also for expecting the best out of your students. A lot of what happens in our institutions these days that we play to the gallery, we try and accommodate and understand a lot, and thereby we excuse a lot from our students, understanding a lot, as opposed to expecting them to rise to the occasion, understanding the privilege of being in this particular space, in this moment, and what they can bring to it. I remember you kicking out a student, Dion, in the class because he never read for class and had lots of questions that if he had read, he wouldn't have those questions. It was very clear. You're the first professor I've seen kick a student out of class I can't imagine anybody doing it in today's context. But that tells you about what you expect from your students and how they must rise to the occasion because you have worked hard to prepare your text, prepare yourself for the moment, and you expect them to meet you at that particular point where learning can happen and where insights can be developed. So I want to thank you for those kinds of examples. I'm also want to thank you for publicly admitting your Marxian strain. Very often people have tried to disassociate you with this. I'm a Marxist myself. I'm a former exile and trained at ANC school in Tanzania, and we grew up on that kind of approach analysis and those tools. And so I really appreciate how you work with that because I find that very clearly in your work. And I think that the transnational approach is very, very particularly important for us to help us slay the monster of our own burdens and limitations and our inheritance as a result of colonialism and imperialism and racism that we've inherited. And without breaking those, we will forever remain prisoners of this paradigm and the way we look at things. And our solutions will not be solutions to take us forward, but to keep us contained and trapped in the moment. So mine is to thank you on your birthday and to say to you, I'm a beneficiary of the work that you've done, and I'm very grateful. I was privileged to learn from you in a class, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. Thank you very much.
Edwin, I'm very touched by what you said, and I liked your preamble very much as well. And I think you touch on an important thing. The way that students in modern universities have bought the managerialist rubbish, in this sense, that they think they've hired me to give them something and that there's some sort of contract where they are clients. And so you can't throw a student out of a class now, and that's terrible. Because one of the first things you should do is throw out some students. It's the ideal thing to do, to indicate exactly your point. In pedagogic terms, I have expectations of you. You do not have a right to get the knowledge and the modes of approaching knowledge and knowledge production from me. We're in this together. And we are not equals, actually. If you're equal, write your own degree certificate and bugger off. We're unequal. Now, I have to accept that you're open and willing and keen, and it's my job to assess your capacity, your interest, and bring the best out of you. But you are not my client, and I'm not your hireling, and you have a right for me to cater for every single of your foibles. So the whole term of pedagogy, the whole nature of teaching has changed. And students think it's a great advance. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. And if they sat and reflected on it, and so you say you're thankful. I'm thankful to have had students like you. I'm the one who should be grateful, because never ever confuse the idea that you're simply teaching. If you're teaching properly, you will be learning from your students, and you'll especially be learning from the postgraduate students. You'll be a very, very stupid person if you leave a postgraduate class and you haven't learned something for a student. Don't tell them, it's bad for them. Don't tell them that you've learned something from them. It's bad and it buggers them up. But you'd be a very silly person if you didn't acknowledge how much you've learned from students. I can't think of, when I think of some really brilliant, talented PhD students I have, they're always very kind and they're generous. They never understand how much I stole from them. They never, ever understand. Good teachers are good thieves.
Good thieves, remember that. Is that it?
Oh, sorry, there are two other points I want to make, just for the record. First of all, on the psychohistory thing, it was my privilege, and you know this, James, and the university will know this, for many, many years to have worked with my dear friend, Chobani Manganyi, both at WITS and here. And Chobani Manganyi is a great, great psychologist, psychiatrist. He has magic in his writings. He's an elderly man. I cannot tell you how much I learned and how sensitized I was to the psychological dimensions of racial oppression. Without Raifa, and Chobani is just magnificent in rising above it in a nationalist way and telling you here are the social and psychological dimensions of racism. So I was deeply indebted to him. I also worked with Zeke, okay, who afterwards didn't want to be known as Zeke because of filthy colonial imperialist name, and then he became Eskia. But for me, he'll always be Zeke Mpashlele. Brilliant novelist, sensitive, insightful. Again, these are people that if you read the novels, the point that Lindy was making, historian who's not reading novels is only doing half the job. Novels provide you with the grease and insight and wordsmithing that you need in order to be able to tell a story. The other thing that my other big failure here today was to fail to acknowledge how important it is for a historian to find a proper publisher. A publisher who loves the discipline and what you're doing. And I was adopted because I stray los hotnot, as they say, in the Cape, by Jonathan Ball, who had a love of history and wasn't interested purely in the financial dimension of it, but was willing to take the long haul, and his successor, Jonathan Ball. So if you can find a publisher who has an authentic interest in what you're doing that transcends how many copies they can sell, and is willing to take the long view, this book will sell, but it will sell slowly over a long time. It's not going to go to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. It's vital that you establish an understanding with the publisher. And you need to look at publishers and work out where their hearts are and where their wallets are. And find yourself a publisher who's got a heart as well as a wallet. These are key things. And they have been extremely supportive of me. Not all these books sell. Fortunately, each one of you is not going to leave the room without having bought 2 copies of what I've got here. But you do need to have an understanding publisher, and I've been very lucky.
Just by way of footnotes, Charles has talked about Manganyi. There's something very special about this generation. Manganyi used to drive all the way. Manganyi had been a DVC here. Manganyi made it a point to drive all the way from Johannesburg to come and tell me as the director what he is doing. James, I just want to tell you that I'm working. This is what I am doing. It takes responsibility and discipline to do that. Charles does the same. This is what I'm working on. That too is discipline. I worked closely with Eskia, and they insist on reciprocity. If you are going to expect something from me, you must also give. One time I went with Eskia to address the youth in Yeoville. The youth arrived 1 hour late, smoking away, relaxed, and he gave them a tongue lash, because that is our role. If you're going to let students get away with stupid things, you are not helping them. You're basically destroying them. And at the end of that workshop, they all came apologizing to him. And I told the organizers, never do this again. This is an old man. He spent his time to come here, and you keep him waiting for 1 hour. That is not on. And I think there's something for us. And I think what Prof is saying about students, you're not helping students if you are being too liberal. I used to tell students, they were given a window of 10 minutes within which to be in your lecture. After that, I closed the door, because we are focusing. Then we had this one who kept walking in every time, 20 minutes late. So I told him, hey, young man, you know, lectures are not compulsory. You don't have to come in. But it's my right. You know, it's not your right. You are late. Don't come in and disturb the others who are serious. So that's one thing that I really love about this generation. Now, in ending, I want to invite, I gave you the story of Eskia telling me that when you sit on a chair of leadership, don't be restless. I hate bureaucracy in the same way that Charles hates nationalism or nationalists. I hate bureaucrats, you know. So if I've been leadership and every other day you are calling meetings, I tell you, you're wasting my time. Yeah, I want to work, you know. I wake up, I come here, I want to work. Don't call me for endless meetings. And that's one thing that I learned from Prof. Robin. And I continued with that tradition. I only call meetings when it is necessary. Somebody reminded me, but you don't call meetings. I said, what do you want meetings for? You know, we have one-on-one meetings with you. You tell me what you're doing. What more? What do you want? Why do you want to call? I call all these old men, you know, to come and meet. Lois, come. Peter, you know. I stopped that. I learned that from, Robin was the founding director of our center, and he generously appointed me as his deputy when I came here. And after that, I took over from him almost 8 years back. Robin, I want you to give a vote of thanks to your friend and colleague. Don't believe what they tell you. Charles talked about moving from Wits to this place. I was there. By the way, I was there in '94. One young, cheeky guy, at the height of student must fall, came to me. You are keeping all these racists that ran away from Wits. I said, tell me more. And when I told him, do you know, I was there. I was a member of a SAU, staff union. I was there. The only African in a SAU at that time. I remember I was also with another man who was working in their center called Russell Ali. I think, you know, Charles will remember Russell Ali. And then we had, you know, another old man who was always very generous, seeking to mediate and bring about peace and stability. So those who keep talking about some of these without knowledge, I remind them, I was there and I was part of it and I knew the dynamics more than anybody else. Prof. Robin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, James. A week or so ago, I said to Charles, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to attend this occasion. I'll have to make do with the YouTube version. But James very kindly invited me to come. And I'm actually delighted that I'm able to be here in person and to experience this very rich discussion, which has taken place this afternoon, which I think has given us a wonderful insight into the work that Charles has done, and also the motivation behind it. I just want to recount one brief anecdote. Charles said that he has two sides to his personality. The one is the revolutionary, and the other one, which requires discipline, rigor, and tightness. And when Charles first came to the University of Pretoria, he was in charge of a program that was funded by the Mellon Foundation, which has as its function the development of a cohort of young scholars who are doing their PhDs. And if you ever wanted to see a program that was driven by discipline, rigor, and tightness, that is a prime example of it. And the products of that program went on to be very significant scholars in their own fields. And their fields ranged over a very broad range. They weren't just in the humanities. But Charles had the ability to be able to distinguish what was a good proposal, even if it was by a person who was studying fungi, and was going on to actually develop a significant career. So I think that gives you some measure of the kinds of contributions that he's made, not only to history, but to the broader academic community. And I think that what it does is it underscores one of the things that is really critical about universities, and that is to have places of scholarship. And these places of scholarship which give people the freedom to explore their ideas and develop their scholarship in a less bureaucratically constrained environment. And I think that was one of the main things for the establishment of the center, was precisely to create a place where people could pursue their scholarship irrespective of the fact that they had reached retiring age. Because retiring age is not a cliff that you fall off. And your scholarship can certainly go on for a very long time after that. And we've had two examples of that given to us this afternoon. First of all, Charles, and secondly, Chabani Manganya. Both of them were in the center from its very beginning. And both of them had a very strong hand in actually shaping what it's come to be at the present time. So I would like to thank all of you for attending, for all the panelists. Of course, Charles, for providing us with this opportunity to explore all these ideas, and also to recognize the tremendous contribution that you've made to scholarship, both here and elsewhere. And finally, to James, thank you for creating this opportunity to be able to celebrate the scholarship this afternoon. So thank you all very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Can I just ask you to remain here? Christy, I told you we have one little ritual. I just want you to hand over this to Charles.
Charles?
We have a small gift for you here.
This is called a rogues gallery.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Charles.
Oh, we need to stand in front of it.
Let's stand here. And, you can hold it.